The evening rush at La Blanche, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, was in full swing. The clicking of designer heels against marble floors mixed with the gentle clinking of crystal glasses and soft violin music playing in the background. Among the busy servers weaving through tables was Ming, a painted woman in her mid-20s, carrying plates with the grace of a dancer. Her long black hair was neatly tied back in a professional bun, and despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes, she maintained a gentle smile that reached her eyes. This was her second shift of the day, but you wouldn't know it from her careful attention to every table. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on her shoulders. Her grandmother's care and her younger sister's growing medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. "Table 12 needs more wine," whispered her co-worker as they passed each other. Ming nodded, already adjusting her route to the wine cellar. Table 12 meant dealing with Maxwell Thompson, and that always required extra patience. Maxwell Thompson was a regular at La Blanche, a tech millionaire who had made his fortune developing trading software. He was the kind of customer who would send back perfectly cooked steaks and complain about room temperature wine that was, in fact, served at precisely the right temperature. Tonight, he was hosting a group of potential investors, which meant he was being particularly demanding. "Ah, there you are, Thompson," he called out as Ming approached with the wine. "I was beginning to think we'd been forgotten." His words carried that particular tone of someone who had never worked in service a day in his life. The other guests at his table shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Ming maintained her professional composure as she presented the bottle of Chateau Margaux. "My apologies for the wait, sir. Would you like to taste it first?" Her voice was soft but clear, with just a hint of an accent that she had worked hard to soften over the years. As she poured the wine, she could feel Thompson watching her with that calculating look she'd come to recognize from wealthy patrons who viewed servers as part of the furniture. What she didn't expect was what came next. "You handle yourself well," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "We're having a charity gala at my house next weekend. High-profile guests, very exclusive. We could use someone with your attention to detail." He named a figure that was triple her usual night's earnings. Ming's heart skipped a beat. That kind of money could cover her sister's next round of treatment with enough left over for her grandmother's medications. She knew working for Thompson would be challenging. His reputation for being difficult was well known among the staff. But some opportunities were too important to pass up, even if they came wrapped in thinly veiled condescension. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Thompson," she replied carefully. "I would be honored to help." She wrote down the details he provided, all while a small voice in her head wondered if she was making a mistake. As she walked back to the kitchen, Ming passed the restaurant's grand piano, positioned perfectly in the corner of the main dining room. For a moment, her fingers twitched at her side, muscle memory from a different life trying to surface. She quickly pushed the feeling away. She hadn't touched a piano in 10 years, not since that rainy night when everything changed. Little did she know that accepting Thompson's offer would bring her past rushing back in ways she never expected, and that sometimes the hardest notes to play are the ones that have been silent the longest. The week passed quickly, and before Ming knew it, she was standing in front of Thompson Mansion, a towering structure of glass and stone that seemed to touch the evening sky. She hugged her black serving jacket closer, fighting off both the autumn chill and her growing nervousness. Other servers hired from various upscale restaurants were arriving, their expressions a mix of awe and anxiety. Everyone gathered around, called the head server, a stern-looking woman with graying hair. "Mr. Thompson's guests are Manhattan's elite. One mistake could cost us all our jobs." She handed out serving trays and assigned sections. Ming got the main living room, the heart of the party. The mansion's interior took Ming's breath away. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow shadows across marble floors, and priceless artwork adorned every wall. But what caught her eye and made her heart stumble was the magnificent grand piano in the corner of the living room. It wasn't just any piano. It was a Steinway Model D Concert Grand, the exact model she used to practice on at school. "Don't even think about touching it," Thompson's voice came from behind her, making her jump. He was already dressed in an expensive tuxedo, a glass of scotch in hand. That's a $500,000 instrument. We have a professional pianist coming later. His tone carried that familiar mix of amusement and disdain. The party began, and Ming fell into the familiar rhythm of serving. She glided between guests in designer gowns and custom suits, offering champagne and wine. She overheard snippets of conversations about stock portfolios, yacht purchases, and upcoming charity galas, a world so different from her tiny apartment where she and her grandmother took turns sleeping on the fold-out couch so her sister could have the bedroom. Everything was going smoothly until Thompson's phone rang. His face darkened as he listened. "What do you mean you're not coming?" He barked into the phone. "A better offer. I paid you in advance." He ended the call with a curse. The pianist had canceled. Ming tried to make herself invisible. As Thompson's mood soured, she'd seen his temper at the restaurant before, but here in his own home, he seemed even more imposing. The guests were starting to notice the missing music, the atmosphere growing stale without it. "You, Thompson," he suddenly called out, pointing at Ming. The champagne flutes on her tray clinked as she froze. "I've seen you staring at that piano all night. Think you can do better than serving drinks." The room grew quiet. Dozens of eyes turned to her, some curious, others already embarrassed on her behalf. Thompson's face held a cruel smile. He was looking for entertainment, and she was his target. "I don't," Ming started to say, but Thompson was already walking towards her, taking her serving tray and handing it to another server. "Come on, show us what you can do," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Unless you're afraid." The challenge in his voice was clear. This was punishment for her supposed presumption, for daring to look too long at something beyond her station. Ming felt her cheeks burn. In her mind, she could hear her grandmother's voice. Sometimes pride must bow to necessity. She had taken this job for the money, had endured Thompson's attitude for her family, but standing there with all those privileged eyes on her, something else stirred. A spark of the person she used to be before life had forced her to set her dreams aside. The piano seemed to call to her from across the room. 10 years of dust had settled on her dreams of performing, but underneath, the muscle memory waited. As she took her first step toward the instrument, her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She didn't know if she was about to experience triumph or humiliation, but she knew she had to try. As Ming walked toward the piano, memories flooded back like a tidal wave. She remembered the old upright piano in their living room, where her mother first taught her to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star when she was just 4 years old. Her tiny fingers would stretch across the keys while sitting on a stack of phone books to reach the proper height. Those early lessons had turned into something more when her elementary school music teacher noticed her talent. "Your daughter has a gift," she had told Ming's parents. "She hears music differently than other children." Before long, Ming was performing in local competitions, her mother beaming proudly from the audience, her father recording every performance on their old recorder. The acceptance letter from Juilliard's pre-OL program, it felt like a golden ticket. Every Saturday, her father would drive her into the city from their modest home in Queens, leaving at dawn to beat the traffic. She'd spend entire days immersed in music theory, practice sessions, and performances. Her teachers spoke of future concert halls and international tours. The other students came from wealthy families, but in the practice rooms, only talent mattered. Then came that rainy October night. 10 years ago, Ming had been practicing late at school for an upcoming recital when her grandmother called. Her parents' car had skidded on the wet highway. They never made it home. The following weeks passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and impossible decisions. Her sister, only 8 at the time, needed special medical care for her chronic condition. Their grandmother, who moved in to take care of them, was too old to work. The insurance money wouldn't last long. Ming still remembered standing in the Juilliard administrative office, withdrawing from the program. Her teacher had protested, talking about scholarships and special arrangements, but Ming knew the truth. Her family needed her to work, not chase dreams. She found the waitressing job at La Blanche through a family friend. The restaurant's elegant atmosphere reminded her of concert halls, and sometimes, during quiet moments, she would hear classical music in her head, her fingers moving slightly as she carried plates. Over the years, she'd avoided pianos completely. The grand piano at the restaurant was easy to ignore. It was usually covered, and the pianists who played there were professionals who came and went without speaking to the staff. But this Steinway before her now was different. It stood proud and open, its black surface gleaming under the chandelier lights, keys waiting expectantly like old friends hoping to reconnect. A murmur went through the crowd as she approached the instrument. She could hear Thompson's smug chuckle and feel the weight of judgment from his wealthy guests. They were expecting a disaster, a clumsy server embarrassing herself for their entertainment. What they didn't see were the calluses still on her fingers from years of practice, hidden by the professional manicure required for serving. They didn't know about the countless hours she spent mastering scales and arpeggios, or the way she still heard symphonies in her dreams. As she sat down on the bench, adjusting it with a familiar motion that had once been as natural as breathing, her grandmother's words from long ago echoed in her mind. "Music is in your blood, little one. It's not something you do. It's something you are." Ming placed her hands on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingers. The muscle memory was there, waiting like a language she'd learned in childhood, rusty from disuse but not forgotten. In that moment, she wasn't the server anymore. She was that young girl again, sitting at her first recital, her mother's voice whispering, "Play from your heart and they will listen." The party guests had formed a loose circle around the grand piano, their faces showing a mix of curiosity and secondhand embarrassment. Crystal glasses clinked as people shifted uncomfortably, waiting for what they assumed would be an awkward spectacle. Thompson stood at the front, his expression caught between amusement and impatience. Ming closed her eyes for a moment, letting the familiar smell of polished wood and ivory wash over her. The Steinway even smelled expensive, a rich, deep scent that spoke of careful maintenance and regular tuning. Her serving uniform felt stiff and confining as she adjusted her posture on the bench, muscle memory from countless lessons taking over. Well, Thompson's voice cut through her concentration. "We don't have all night." A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Poor girl," just loud enough for Ming to hear. Taking a deep breath, Ming recalled her last performance at Juilliard. She had played Chopin that day, too, her mother's favorite composer. The piece had earned her a standing ovation and a nomination for a prestigious young artist competition, a competition she never got to attend. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne No. 20 in C minor floated into the air. Ming's fingers moved tentatively at first, like someone testing the temperature of a pool before diving in. The piece started softly, almost questioning, perfect for her uncertain return to the keys after so long. A woman in a red designer dress who had been mid-sip of champagne slowly lowered her glass. The quiet conversations around the piano died away. Even the servers stopped their rounds, standing still with their trays of appetizers, watching as Ming reached the end of the first phrase. Muscle memory fully kicked in. Her hands remembered the way the piece swelled and softened like waves on a peaceful shore. The Steinway responded beautifully to her touch, its rich tone filling the massive room with warmth. Thompson's smirk began to fade as he took a step closer to the piano, his brow furrowing as he watched Ming's fingers dance across the keys with increasing confidence. This wasn't the fumbling attempt he had expected. This was something else entirely. The piece grew more complex, building toward its emotional center. Ming felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't stop. Each note brought back memories, her mother humming along as she practiced, her father's proud smile, her sister falling asleep on the couch listening to her play. An older gentleman in the crowd leaned forward, his eyes wide with recognition. He whispered something to his companion, who nodded vigorously. Ming didn't notice. She was lost in the music now, her body swaying slightly as she played the flowing melody. The room's atmosphere had transformed. The same people who moments ago had been preparing to witness her humiliation now stood transfixed. Some had closed their eyes. Others were expressions of genuine amazement. A young woman in the back wiped away a tear. As Ming approached the piece's climax, her fingers moved with the ease of someone who had played this music thousands of times. The Steinway sang under her touch, its powerful bass notes resonating through the floorboards while the higher registers sparkled like starlight. Thompson stood frozen, his half-empty wine glass forgotten in his hand. The cruel entertainment he had planned had turned into something entirely unexpected. Instead of humiliating a server, he had unknowingly put a masterful musician on display. The piece's final section approached, and Ming played it with all the emotion she had held back over the years. Each note carried the weight of her sacrificed dreams, her love for her family, and the unexpected joy of returning to her first love, music. As she played the final phrases, time seemed to stop in the grand room. Every person was held captive by the beauty of what they were witnessing. As the last notes of Chopin's Nocturne faded into the hushed silence of the room, Ming's hands rested gently on the keys for a moment. No one moved or spoke. The spell of her performance hung in the air like morning mist, delicate and ethereal. Then, as if a dam had broken, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite, reserved clapping of wealthy people being charitable. It was genuine, enthusiastic, and heartfelt. People were standing, some wiping tears from their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Extraordinary, breathed the silver-haired woman in a blue evening gown. Simply extraordinary. Her companion nodded vigorously, still clapping. Ming felt her cheeks flush as she stood from the piano bench. The familiar motion of smoothing her serving apron brought her back to reality. She was still at work, still there to serve these people. But something had shifted in the way they looked at her. Thompson stood rooted to his spot, his face a complex mixture of emotions, embarrassment, amazement, and something that might have been shame. The cruel joke he had intended had transformed into a moment of unexpected beauty, and he didn't quite know how to handle it. "Young lady," a distinguished-looking gentleman made his way through the crowd. His accent was European, possibly German, and he carried himself with the air of someone important. That was a remarkable interpretation of Chopin. "Where did you study?" Before Ming could answer, another voice cut in. "She doesn't just serve drinks, does she, Thompson?" This came from a woman in her 50s, her gray hair elegantly styled, wearing a simple but obviously expensive black dress. "I'm curious, did you know about her talent when you tried to humiliate her?" Thompson opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, the wealthy tech millionaire seemed at a loss for words. The European gentleman was still focused on Ming. "My dear, I'm the director of the city's orchestra. We have a community program that brings music education to underprivileged children. Would you be interested in teaching? The salary is modest compared to performing." Ming's heart skipped a beat. Teaching music, the possibility of returning to the world she had left behind, even in a different role, made her hands tremble slightly. "I haven't played in 10 years, she admitted softly. "Not since my parents." Her voice trailed off, but the symphony director's kind eyes showed understanding. "Music never truly leaves us," he said gently. "What you just played proved that. Think about it. Here's my card." Other guests began approaching her with their own questions and comments. A mother asked if Ming would consider teaching her daughter. A retired pianist wanted to discuss her technique, and the woman in the black dress turned out to be a board member at a prestigious music school. In the midst of this, Ming caught sight of Thompson making his way toward her. The crowd parted slightly, watching with interest. He stopped in front of her and, for a moment, just looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, his usual arrogance absent from his voice. What I tried to do, was cruel and beneath me." He paused, then continued, "Would you tell me your story, the real one, not just what's on your job application?" Ming looked at the man who had tried to embarrass her just minutes ago, seeing the genuine regret in his eyes. Around them, the party had resumed its normal flow. But nothing felt normal anymore. In the span of one piece of music, her world had shifted on its axis. She glanced at the piano, then back at Thompson. "It's a long story," she said softly, "and it begins with an old upright piano and a little girl who fell in love with music." As the party continued around them, Ming and Thompson sat in a quiet corner of the vast living room. She had removed her serving apron, and someone had handed her a glass of water. The piano stood silently in the background, a reminder of how quickly life can change. I was 12 when I got into Juilliard's pre-L program. Ming began, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her water glass. My parents were immigrants. My father worked as a mechanic. My mother cleaned houses. They spent every extra penny on my music lessons. Thompson listened intently, his usual impatience nowhere to be seen. The symphony director had joined them, along with the woman in the black dress, who introduced herself as a trustee of the Manhattan Music Academy. Every Saturday, my father would drive me into the city, Ming continued. He never complained about the early mornings or the long waits. He packed lunch for us both, always bringing extra in case I made new friends. Ming smiled at the memory. My mother recorded every single performance on this old video camera. She wanted to document my journey to Carnegie Hall. She paused, taking a sip of water. Then came the accident. My sister was 8, already dealing with her medical condition. Our grandmother moved in to help, but she was too old to work. Someone had to support the family, and I was the oldest. But why completely stop playing? The symphony director asked gently. Surely there were other options, Ming shook her head. When you're 16 and suddenly responsible for 3 people's survival, you learn to put dreams away. I couldn't practice 4 hours a day and work enough to pay the bills. The restaurant job paid well and had good tips. It seemed like the responsible choice. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. All this time at La Blanche, hearing the pianist there. I learned to tune it out, Ming said quietly. It hurt less that way, but sometimes late at night when the restaurant was almost empty, I'd hear a piece my mother loved. She trailed off, her eyes distant. The trustee leaned forward. Your talent hasn't diminished. What you played tonight wasn't just muscle memory. That was pure musicianship. The symphony director added, the teaching position, the symphony director. It could be just the beginning. We have practice rooms you could use. There are adult education programs, performance opportunities. Thompson suddenly stood up. Everyone looked at him in surprise. I'd like to help, he said, his voice firm. A scholarship fund perhaps for students like you. We're talented but facing difficult circumstances. Ming stared at him, remembering his cruel smirk just hours ago. People really could surprise you, and he continued, looking slightly embarrassed. I know the owner of La Blanche. I could speak to him about adjusting your schedule, making it more flexible if you decide to pursue music again. The trustee nodded approvingly. The academy could provide performance spaces for the scholarship students, maybe even... She paused, looking at Ming. Would you consider sharing your story with them? Show them that setbacks don't have to be permanent. Ming felt tears forming in her eyes. She thought about her grandmother, who still hummed her old practice pieces while cooking, her sister who had never really heard her play, the years of pushing aside her passion to be responsible. I'd need time to practice, she said slowly, to get back to where I was. Time, the symphony director said kindly, and music. Music waits for us. It's patient that way. Ming looked across the room at the Steinway, its keys still visible in the warm light. For the first time in 10 years, she allowed herself to imagine a future where responsibility and passion could coexist, where the weight of her past could become a foundation instead of a burden. Where would we start? She asked softly. 3 weeks after the party, Ming stood in front of a room full of children at the Community Music Center. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and restlessness as they sat cross-legged on the carpet. A row of keyboards lined the walls, and an old upright piano stood at the front of the room. Music is like magic, she began, her voice gentle, but carrying to every corner. It can make you happy when you're sad, give you energy when you're tired, and tell stories without using any words. A small boy in the front raised his hand. My mom says I have to practice every day, but I don't want to, he said with complete honesty, making the other children giggle. Ming smiled. remembering her own childhood struggles. "Can I tell you a secret?" she asked, kneeling down to their level. "When I was your age, I sometimes didn't want to practice either." She walked to the old upright piano, running her fingers along its scratched surface. The symphony director was right. Getting back into music wasn't like starting over, but like waking up a sleeping part of yourself. "But then my mother taught me something special," she continued. "She said practicing isn't about playing the same thing over and over. It's about telling your own story through music." Ming sat at the piano and played a simple melody with one hand. "This could be the sound of rain on your window," she added with her left hand, creating a gentle harmony. "And this could be the sound of your cat purring or your baby sister laughing." The children leaned forward, their eyes wide. Even the restless ones had gone still, watching her hands move across the keys. Later that afternoon, Ming sat in one of the practice rooms, working on a piece for her upcoming recital. Thompson had kept his word. Not only had he spoken to the restaurant owner about her schedule, but he had also established a scholarship fund for young musicians facing financial hardships. The trustee from the music academy had become her mentor, helping her navigate her return to the music world. "You're not just teaching them notes," she had told Ming. "You're showing them that dreams can take detours but still find their way home." Ming's fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence. She was practicing Debussy now, her grandmother's favorite. The piece still needed work, but each day brought back more of her old skill, enhanced by a depth of emotion that only life experience could bring. A knock at the practice room door made her pause. It was her sister home from college for the weekend. Since the party, Ming had started teaching her simple pieces on their grandmother's old keyboard. It wasn't a Steinway, but it made music all the same. "They love you," her sister said, settling into a chair. "I heard them in the hallway." One little girl told her mother she wants to be just like Teacher Ming when she grows up. Ming felt her heart warm at those words. She thought about that little girl and all the other children in her class. Some came from families like hers, had been struggling to make ends meet but determined to give their children every opportunity. Others had different challenges, different dreams. "Ready to try that?" "Do it," Ming asked her sister, scooting over on the piano bench. Their grandmother had always said that music sounded better when shared. As they played together, Ming realized that her mother had been right all those years ago. Playing from the heart made people listen. But what she hadn't known then was that sometimes life takes away one dream to lead you to another one that's bigger than yourself. Through the practice room window, she could see the afternoon sun painting the city in shades of gold. Somewhere in that sprawling metropolis, another young musician might be setting aside their dreams, thinking they had to choose between passion and responsibility. Ming hoped her story would reach them, showing that sometimes the most beautiful melodies come after the longest rests. 1 year later, Ming stood backstage at the community center's auditorium, her heart racing with familiar pre-performance butterflies. The annual student showcase was about to begin, and through the curtain, she could hear the excited murmur of the packed audience. Her students were lined up beside her, dressed in their best outfits, nervously adjusting their sheet music. The little boy who had once complained about practicing was now bouncing on his toes, eager to show off the piece he had mastered. "Remember what we talked about," Ming whispered to them, kneeling down. "It's not about playing perfectly. It's about sharing your love of music." In the audience sat her grandmother, beaming with pride, alongside her sister, who had driven in from college for the event. Thompson was there too. He had become one of the program's biggest supporters, regularly attending student recitals and funding additional music education initiatives across the city. The shows began with her youngest students playing simple duets, their small fingers carefully picking out melodies they had practiced for weeks. Each performance was met with enthusiastic applause, parents leaning forward to record every moment on their phones, just as Ming's mother had done years ago. During intermission, the symphony director found her backstage. "The board is impressed with what you've accomplished here," he said warmly. "They want to expand the program to other community centers. We'd like you to help develop the curriculum." Ming felt tears pricking at her eyes. Her teaching schedule had grown from one small class to several, including an evening program for adults who, like her, had set aside their musical dreams. Some of her students were former servers, office workers, and taxi drivers, all finding their way back to music. The second half of the showcase featured her advanced students. As she watched them perform, she remembered each breakthrough moment, each small victory that had led to this point. The shy girl who now played with confidence, the frustrated boy who had finally found his rhythm. For the finale, Ming had planned something special. She took her place at the grand piano, a new one donated by Thompson to replace the old upright. Her students gathered around, each holding their instruments. Together, they performed an arrangement she had written, weaving together classical themes with simple melodies her students had composed. It was a piece about journeys, about falling down and getting back up, about dreams that take unexpected paths. As the last notes faded, Ming caught sight of a new face in the audience, the owner of La Blance. She still worked there occasionally, but now as the restaurant's regular pianist for special events. Life had come full circle in the most unexpected way. After the performance, during the reception, her grandmother pulled her aside. In her hands was an old, worn envelope. "Your mother wrote this," she said softly. "The day you got into Juilliard, she wanted you to read it when you gave your first big concert." Ming opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, in her mother's elegant handwriting, was a simple message: "Music will always lead you home." Looking around the room at her students chatting excitedly with their families, at Thompson discussing future programs with a symphony director, at her sister recording everything on her phone just like their mother used to do, Ming felt a deep sense of peace. She had become the concert pianist her parents had dreamed of, but she had found something perhaps even more meaningful: the ability to keep their love of music alive by passing it on to others. Every time one of her students discovered the joy of playing, every time an adult rekindled their passion for music, her parents' legacy grew stronger. The community center lights began to dim, signaling the end of the evening. But for Ming and her students, this was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new pieces to learn, new challenges to overcome, and new dreams to chase. As she gathered her sheet music, Ming hummed softly to herself, the same lullaby her mother used to sing, now transformed into a song of hope for the future. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the heart's detours, from the unexpected harmonies life creates when we're brave enough to play a different tune.